The sky started dying at noon. Not slowly, not with warnings, not with the kind of gradual dimming that gives people time to look up, register what they are seeing, and make a choice about what to do next. One moment the sky above the Aelhari homeworld of Veth Solara was the pale violet color it had been for 10,000 years. The next moment it was orange, then red, then the color that had no name, the color that fire makes when it is very large and very close and falling toward you from a direction fire is not supposed to come from. The orbital defense platforms went silent first. They had not been designed for combat. The Aelhari had no combat platforms. They had observation posts and science stations and cargo relay hubs and a handful of old transport vessels that moved supplies between colony settlements. The closest thing they had to a military was a small emergency response unit that handled natural disasters. The platforms did not fight back. They simply ceased transmitting. In the council chambers of the High Spire, in the glowing capital city of Valanthas, High Chancellor Sci-Fi was standing at the great transparent wall that formed the eastern face of the building, watching the sky change color, when her chief communications officer burst through the sealed doors behind her without knocking. His name was Elder Dovan, and he was old. Old even by Aelhari standards, with a shell that had gone the pale gold color of aged bone and eyes that had seen more decades than most species lived through. He had been an elder of the council for longer than some of its younger members had been alive. In all that time, across every crisis and difficulty and political emergency the civilization had weathered, Sci-Fi had never seen him run. He was running now. High Chancellor! He stopped beside her. His secondary arms were pressed tight against his thorax, a gesture of controlled fear that Aelhari made when they were trying very hard not to show how afraid they actually were. The sensor feeds have confirmed the count. Sci-Fi did not look away from the sky. Tell me. 590 vessels, High Chancellor, possibly more. They are still arriving through fold space. The formation is an encirclement pattern. They are positioning around the entire planet, 590. Sci-Fi finally turned from the window. She looked at Dovan. She looked at the council members behind him. 9 Aelhari elders of various ages and disciplines gathered in the chamber not because they had been called, but because they had seen the sky and understood that this was a place you went toward when the sky looked like that, not away from. The Drakkari, she said. No one answered. No one had to. The name carried its own weight. Every species in the explored galaxy knew the name Drakkari. The stories had been circulating for longer than Veth Solara had been a spacefaring world. Reptilian, massive, armored by nature and temperament and 10 millennia of conquest. They had no interest in culture, no interest in trade, no interest in the kinds of patient cooperative relationships that the Aelhari had spent 10,000 years building with their neighbors. They wanted one thing, everything. 17 civilizations had encountered the Drakkari. Of those 17, 6 had managed to negotiate arrangements that left them technically alive but functionally enslaved, stripped of resources and autonomy, maintained as a labor population for Drakkari extraction operations. The other 11 had chosen to resist. The galaxy still had the scars from those 11. Have they sent a communication? Sci-Fi asked. Dovan's voice was careful in the way that voices became careful when they were carrying something terrible. Their fleet commander sent a direct transmission 40 minutes ago. It was addressed to all citizens of Veth Solara simultaneously.
What did it say?
The elder who answered was not Dovan. It was the youngest member of the council, an Aelhari named Mira, who stood at the far end of the chamber with her arms wrapped around herself and her large compound eyes reflecting the orange light from the window. Mira was a scholar and a policy theorist. She had written extensively about diplomatic frameworks and conflict resolution. She had models and systems and carefully constructed arguments for how species with opposing interests could find common ground. She had no argument for this. It said we have 2 choices, Mira told Sci-Fi quietly. We can surrender now and serve them. Or we can resist and be an example for other species considering resistance, she paused. The transmission included visual documentation of what they mean by example. Sci-Fi did not ask to see the documentation. The sky shook, not metaphorically. The entire building moved. a deep subsonic vibration that came up through the floor and into the bones and settled there like dread given physical form. Through the eastern wall, Sci-Fi watched a line of fire trace itself across the upper atmosphere, an orbital station. She did not know which one. She did not know how many people had been aboard. She turned back to her council.
Options, she said. Silence.
The kind of silence that spaces fill when no one has anything useful to say and everyone knows it. There is one thing, Mira said. She was reaching into the inner pocket of her robe. What she pulled out was old, unmistakably, uncomfortably old. A device no larger than a fist, its casing worn smooth by decades of handling, its surface marked with symbols in a script that no living Aelhari could read fluently. There is the beacon. Dovan moved faster than Sci-Fi had seen him move in years. He crossed the room toward Mira in 3 quick strides, his secondary arms reaching forward. No, he said. His voice had lost all its careful control. Mira, no. You do not know what you are proposing. I know exactly what I am proposing. Mira did not retreat. She held the device against her chest and looked at Dovan with steady eyes. I have read the same histories you have, Elder. I know who answers this beacon. I know what the Assembly said about them. I know the stories. She looked past him to Sci-Fi. I also know that without this beacon, in 48 hours Veth Solara will not exist in any meaningful sense. The Drakkari do not offer second chances. Another explosion, closer this time. The lights in the chamber flickered. Sci-Fi crossed the room and held out her hand. Mira placed the beacon in it. The device was heavier than it looked. Not physically, its weight was about what you would expect from an object that size, but there was something about holding it that made the arms feel heavier. The Galactic Assembly had given this to the Aelhari 300 years ago during an alliance summit that most of the current council's parents had attended. They had given it with very clear instructions and a very clear warning. The instructions: press the activation panel if your species faces extinction-level threat and all other options have been exhausted. The warning: understand what you are asking for. The Assembly had explained it carefully. In the outer rim of explored space, beyond the territories of every known spacefaring species, there was a quarantine zone. 100 star systems enclosed within a boundary that the Assembly maintained with extraordinary seriousness. No one crossed that boundary uninvited. No one visited without authorization. The species inside it did not come out. They had agreed to this arrangement 300 years ago, not because they had been defeated. Not because they had been contained by force, because the Assembly had offered them a deal, 100 worlds of their own, resources to do with as they wished, freedom to develop without interference, in exchange for staying inside those borders and leaving the rest of the galaxy to its own development. The humans had agreed. The Assembly had privately considered this the greatest diplomatic success in recorded history, and also the most terrifying arrangement they had ever negotiated, because the humans had not agreed because they were weak. They had agreed because they were bored. High Chancellor, Dovan was standing in front of her now, his old voice heavy with something that was not quite fear and not quite grief, but lived somewhere in the territory between them. The Assembly warned us. The stories that exist about these creatures, do you know them? Do you really know them? I know them, Sci-Fi said. They are not like us. His voice dropped lower. They are not like any species we have ever dealt with. The Assembly put them in that quarantine not because they were dangerous to other species. They put them there because of what happened when they encountered other species. The humans do not have a normal relationship with violence. They treat it like a language, like a tool, like something you pick up and use and set down and pick up again without it leaving marks on you. Sci-Fi looked at the beacon. She looked at the orange sky through the eastern wall. She thought about the station she had just watched fall. She thought about the documentation that Mira had chosen not to show her. She pressed the activation panel. The beacon warmed in her hands. A pulse of soft light moved beneath its surface, once, twice, 3 times. Then the light faded. The device went cold and dark. Dovan said nothing. No one said anything. Sci-Fi set the beacon on the council table and looked at it for a moment. Then she turned back to the window. Now we wait, she said. Outside, the sky continued to burn. and somewhere across a distance that light took years to cross, in a region of space that most of the galaxy tried very hard not to think about too carefully, an alarm began to sound. The alarm was heard in 17 places simultaneously. That was how the Terran response grid worked. When a signal arrived from an emergency beacon, one of the 12 that had been distributed to member species of the Galactic Assembly over the centuries, it did not ping a single station and wait for someone to check their messages. It hit every active facility in the human quarantine zone at the same moment, every military installation, every fleet command center, every admiralty office. It woke people up. Admiral Mara Solana was already awake when her alarm activated. She was in her office at Titan Command, the largest military facility in the Sol system, reviewing logistics reports at 2 in the morning because that was when the logistics reports arrived, and she had a rule about not letting them sit. She had been awake for 19 hours. She was on her 3rd coffee. She was in her working uniform, which meant she was presentable but not ceremonial, which meant anyone who saw her would be able to tell she had been working rather than sleeping. The alarm changed the shape of everything she had been doing. She was at the main operations floor in 4 minutes. "What do we have?" she asked as she walked through the door. Her duty commander, a heavy-set man named Commander 10, looked up from the central display with an expression that Solano recognized. It was the expression people made when information had arrived that was too large to process quickly and was sitting in the mind demanding to be dealt with before the mind was ready. "Emergency beacon," 10 said. "Assembly registered. Origin is the Aelhari home system." The Aelhari? Solano pulled up the file. The Aelhari insectoid. Non-aggressive, long-term members of the Galactic Assembly's Inner Council, known for their expertise in xenobotany and their extensive trade networks. No military capability to speak of. Peaceful to a degree that humans found simultaneously admirable and difficult to fully comprehend. "What's threatening them?" 10 pointed to the sensor analysis on the secondary screen, long-range readings through the relay network. "We are detecting a fleet in the Aelhari home system. 590 confirmed contacts, possibly more." Solano stopped reading. 590, she said. "Yes, Admiral. And we know whose? Energy signatures are consistent with Drakkari technology." 10 paused. The full war fleet." Solano set down her coffee. She stood at the display and looked at the numbers. 590 Drakkari warships in the Aelhari home system, orbiting a planet with a population of approximately 900 million people who had no ability to defend themselves. She thought about the Aelhari. She thought about species she had only read about in assembly briefings. Gentle, curious, with their strange compound eyes and their soft forests that glowed at night and their absolute certainty that the universe was fundamentally a place worth loving. She thought about what the Drakkari did to species they considered prey. "How long to assemble a response fleet?" she asked. "Depends on what we're calling a response fleet," 10 said carefully. "If we're talking about available vessels that can be mission ready within 6 hours. I want names and numbers in 10 minutes, Solano said. "And I want every crew that volunteers, not assigned, volunteers only. No one is ordered on this mission." She turned toward the door. "Get me Admiral Varric on the line, and the Assembly's emergency contact. We need to notify them we're responding."
"Admiral?"
10's voice stopped her at the doorway. "You understand what this means if we go out there. The quarantine agreement specifically permits response to an emergency beacon, but the last time a human fleet operated outside our territory was... It has never happened. Not since the quarantine was established." "I know," Solano said. "The Assembly is going to have opinions. The Assembly can express their opinions after 900 million people are not dead," she replied. "That is the sequence of events I prefer." She went to wake up her ships. The response was faster than she expected. Within 3 hours of the announcement going through every military channel in the human quarantine zone, the request for volunteers had been answered by more crews than there were available ships to hold them. Not all of them could go. There were only so many vessels that could be brought to mission-ready status in the time available. But the fact that they were there, that they showed up, that human soldiers and pilots and engineers and medics, heard that a species they had never met was being destroyed, and started asking where to sign. That was something. Solano stood on the deck of her flagship, the carrier-class vessel called the Persistent Will, and watched the fleet assemble around her. 212 ships. Some of them had not been active in years and smelled like the past when you walked through their airlocks. Some of them were newer and faster and smelled like manufacturing. All of them had crews who had volunteered. She walked the flagship's bridge while the final pre-departure checks ran. She looked at her officers, young ones, old ones, people she had known for 20 years, and people who had assigned themselves to her command 2 hours ago because they heard the call and came. She opened the ship-wide channel. "This is Admiral Solano," she said. "Most of you have already heard the situation. If you haven't, here it is fast. The Aelhari, a species that has never harmed anyone, that has spent 10,000 years building a civilization based on the idea that peace is worth working for, are being destroyed by the Drakkari war fleet. They sent us a beacon. They asked for help." She paused. "I want to be clear about something before we go. We are not going out there to prove how dangerous we are. We are not going to demonstrate anything. We are going because someone asked. That is the only reason that matters. That is the only reason we need." Another pause. "Get your stations ready. We leave in 20 minutes. She closed the channel. Her navigation officer looked up. "Course plotted, Admiral? The Aelhari system is 7 fold space jumps from our current position. At maximum safe fold drive cycling, we are looking at approximately 3 days. 3 days, Solano thought. She hoped 3 days was not too long. She had no way of knowing. She set course and the fleet moved. 3 days into the Drakkari occupation, the situation on the surface of Veth Solara had become what military strategists would call, with clinical understatement, very bad. The Drakkari ground forces had secured the 3 largest cities within 48 hours of landing. They did not have to fight for them. The Aelhari had tried to resist, not with weapons, but with organization, with obstruction, with the kind of nonviolent resistance that worked well against oppressors who cared about how they appeared. The Drakkari did not care about how they appeared. They moved through cities like weather, occupying space because they had decided to occupy it, and the Aelhari had eventually retreated underground. In the bunker beneath the ruins of the Valantha's government district, High Chancellor Sci-Fi sat in the dark and counted what she had, approximately 9,000 survivors in this bunker. Perhaps another 30,000 scattered across similar underground shelters throughout the city. The planet-wide number was unknown. Communications had been spotty since the Drakkari disabled the primary relay network on day 1. Food and water in this shelter would last approximately 4 more days if strictly rationed. Above them, through 2 meters of engineered stone and substrate, they could hear the Drakkari. Not always, not clearly. But the sound traveled in ways you did not expect. The deep, regular impact of their footsteps, occasionally sounds that were harder to categorize. Chancellor, Nessa, the young communications technician who had been running their last remaining long-range equipment, appeared in the doorway of the small side room Sci-Fi was using as an operations center. She was shaking, not from cold. "The backup sensor array has a reading." Sci-Fi looked up. "Tell me?" "Ships, Chancellor." Entering the system from fold space, Nessa swallowed. "They don't match any Drakkari configuration. Their energy signatures are... I've never seen anything like them. But their heading vector matches." She stopped. "Say it, child." "It matches the quarantine zone, Chancellor." "They are coming from the direction of human space." Sci-Fi stood up slowly. Her legs ached. Everything ached. She had not slept properly in 3 days, and she had not eaten properly in 2, and the weight of 900 million people pressed on her in a way that was very literal, very physical, sitting between her shoulders like something with mass. "How many?" she asked. Nessa checked her screen. "At least 200 confirmed. More still arriving through fold space." She looked up with eyes that were impossible to read. "Chancellor, they're still coming. They keep coming out of fold space, ship after ship. The formation is already larger than anything we have in our database. On the Drakkari flagship, a vessel named the Unbroken Dominion, 7 kilometers long and built like a philosophical argument about the nature of power. Supreme Commander Grath Voran received the sensor alert from his tactical station and felt something unfamiliar move through him. Voran had been commanding the Drakkari war fleet for 32 years. In that time he had overseen the conquest of 11 civilizations. He had walked on 9 separate planets after they fell. He had accepted the terms of surrender from 7 different species leaders, watching them sign documents that erased the independent existence of everything their ancestors had built. He was, by any accounting system you cared to use, extremely good at what he did. He was not used to feeling unfamiliar things. "Report," he said. His voice did not change. Supreme commanders of the Drakkari war fleet did not allow their voices to change when unexpected information arrived. It was a matter of principle. His tactical analyst, a lean Drakkari with lighter-colored scales than the rest of the bridge crew, stepped forward. His name was Soren, and he had been hired not for his combat performance, but for his mind, which processed information at a rate that made senior officers uncomfortable. He studied the data coming from the sensor array with the focused attention of someone who was trying to understand something before he had to report it. New contacts entering the system, Supreme Commander. Fold space arrivals, multiple vectors. They appear to be emerging from... He stopped. "Soren?" Voran said. "The human quarantine zone, sir." Soren looked up. "The ships are coming from the human quarantine zone." The bridge went quiet. Not the productive quiet of a crew working efficiently, the specific heavy quiet that happened when information arrived that changed the parameters of a situation and everyone present needed a moment to recalibrate. The Commander Styx, Voran's second-in-command, spoke first. She was large even for a Drakkari, with battle scars that told the story of a career spent very close to danger, and she had an opinion on most things that she expressed without invitation. "The humans are a quarantine species," she said. "They are contained. The Assembly keeps them locked in their own systems. They cannot be here?" "They are here," Soren said quietly. "Count," Voran said. Soren worked his instruments. He ran the count twice. 207 confirmed contacts, Supreme Commander. The fold space emergence signatures suggest more may be en route. He paused for exactly 1 second. "They are still arriving." Voran stood from his command chair and walked to the viewport. The space beyond the viewport showed the curve of Veth Solara below and the orbital arrangement of his fleet, 590 ships in encirclement pattern, controlling every approach vector, the most overwhelming display of military force the Drakkari had assembled in 40 years. He counted the new arrivals on his secondary display. 211, 214, 219. "Have they made contact?" he asked. "They are broadcasting on all frequencies, sir." The communications officer looked up. "Open channel. They want everyone to hear. Play it." The voice that filled the bridge was female, calm. The kind of calm that was not the absence of tension, but the presence of something that had moved past tension into a different place entirely. "This is Admiral Mara Solano of the Terran Response Fleet. We received a distress beacon from the Aelhari people of Veth Solara 3 days ago. We apologize for the travel time." Fold space is not perfectly cooperative. A brief pause. "To whoever is currently in orbit around this planet, the Aelhari are under our protection. They asked for our help. We're here. You have one opportunity to withdraw your forces from this system peacefully. We are not going to repeat this offer. I recommend you take it seriously." Another pause, and something changed in her voice. Not harder exactly, but more precise. "To the Aelhari people on the surface, stay in shelter. Keep your heads down. This won't take long." Styx laughed. It was a short, sharp sound. 200 ships against nearly 600. She is performing. "It is psychological theater. Commander, we should..." "Tell me about the humans," Soren Voran interrupted. The analyst looked at him. "You have been reading the old records," Voran said. It was not a question. He had seen Soren pull restricted assembly archives 3 days ago when the emergency beacon activated. He had chosen not to ask about it then. He was asking now. "Tell me what you found. What do you think was about to happen? What do you think Grath Voran was feeling in that moment? Write it in the comments, because I want to know if you see what I see when I look at this scene. Soren set down his instruments. He folded his hands in front of him. A Drakkari gesture that meant I am going to say something important and I need you to actually listen. The humans, he began, evolved on a world that should not have produced spacefaring intelligence. Their planet is a catalog of hostile conditions. Temperature extremes that vary from lethal cold to lethal heat within the same landmass, atmospheric events capable of destroying large structures, seismic instability, radiation exposure from their sun that required their bodies to develop self-repair mechanisms that no other known species possesses at the same level. Their oceans cover most of the planet, and their ocean life includes organisms specifically evolved to kill large land-based prey. He paused. In other words, every element of their environment was trying to kill them for several million years. Must harsh worlds produce resilient species, Styx said. Not like this, Soren replied. Most harsh worlds produce species that are very good at surviving, at hiding, at fleeing, at avoiding danger. Human beings evolved differently. They evolved to pursue. They are what xenobiologists classify as persistence predators, a hunting strategy based not on speed or strength or weapons, but on relentless, unending pursuit. They cannot outrun most of their prey. They cannot overpower most of their prey. What they can do is chase their prey indefinitely at a sustainable pace without stopping until the prey exhausts itself and falls. He looked at Styx. They applied this strategy first to animals, then to each other. Then, when they reached space, to anyone who stood in their way. This is history, Soren, Voren said quietly. Tell me something current. Current, Soren nodded once. Current is this: the humans have been inside their quarantine zone for 300 years. During that time, they have had 100 star systems, effectively unlimited resources, and nothing to fight but themselves and the challenges of deep space colonization. They have been doing what humans do when they are not allowed to go to war with anyone else. He paused for effect. They have been improving. The bridge was very quiet. Improving, Voren repeated. Their technology was already advanced when the quarantine was established. In 3 centuries of having nothing to do but engineer solutions to problems, they have had time to refine things. Soren looked at his display. Our weapon systems are designed around energy shields, kinetic armor, standard attack vectors. We know how to defeat these because we have fought species that use them. The humans have had 300 years to design weapons against opponents who use energy shields, kinetic armor, and standard attack vectors. He looked up. We are those opponents, Supreme Commander. We fight the way they trained against. Voren was still. The comms officer spoke carefully. Supreme Commander, the human flagship is hailing us directly. Admiral Solano is requesting a direct line to Fleet Command. A moment passed. Put her through. The screen filled with the face of a human being. Voren had seen images of humans in the assembly records. The images had not fully communicated something that the actual face on his screen communicated very directly: the quality of the eyes. Human eyes were strange. They were small by most species standards, forward-facing in the manner of predators, and they had an intensity to them that was difficult to articulate. Not aggression exactly. Something quieter than aggression, but more permanent.
Commander, Admiral Solano said.
She looked at him the way someone looked at a problem they had already solved.
I will keep this simple. The Aelhari are under our protection. Leave this system now, and this ends peacefully.
Stay, and we find out how the next few hours go.
Voren studied her.
She was half his height. She was soft in the way that species without natural armor were soft. She was sitting in a chair on a ship that was one of 220, facing 590 of the most powerful warships the Drakkari had ever built. She looked bored, not afraid, not performing, not managing anxiety with practiced calm. Actually, genuinely, sitting in her chair bored, as if this conversation was a formality she was completing before moving on to the real work. Something cold moved through Voren's chest. You are outnumbered by nearly 3 to 1, he said. His voice was steady. He had made it steady. Yes, she agreed. You are aware of this. I have 223 ships, you have 591, she said. I can count, Commander. I'm giving you the chance to leave before you find out why the numbers don't mean what you think they mean." She tilted her head slightly. "Your analyst, the one with the light scales, standing behind your left shoulder, tell him he was right about everything." The channel closed. Voran turned slowly and looked at Soren. Soren said nothing. His expression said everything. "Battle stations," Voran said quietly. "All ships. Maximum yield. Target the human fleet." "Everything we have." He looked at his hands. They were very still. That surprised him. He had expected them to shake. The human fleet fired first, not because they were afraid to be fired at, not because they were impatient. Because Admiral Solano had looked at the tactical situation, run the calculations that her officers had run and confirmed 3 times, and made a decision. If you allow an enemy who outnumbers you to fire the opening salvo, you give them the initiative. You let them define the terms of the first exchange. You start the engagement defending instead of pressing. Solano was not interested in defending. "All batteries, synchronized strike, my authorization," she said. "Targets as designated, fire." 223 ships fired as a single system. The coordinated precision of it was something that even the Drakkari sensor operators, who had spent careers analyzing weapon signatures and tactical formations, required several seconds to process. It was not a salvo, individual ships loosing their weapons at a shared target. It was a strike, a precisely timed, exactly synchronized, perfectly coordinated event that hit designated targets across the Drakkari fleet simultaneously, at the same moment without variation. 22 Drakkari warships were neutralized in the first 11 seconds. Not destroyed, not burning, dark. Their systems offline, their engines cold, their crews intact, but the vessels themselves made inoperable by weapon impacts that hit their most critical systems with an accuracy that suggested something beyond simple targeting computers. On his bridge, Grath Voran watched the tactical display update in real time. 22 ships gone in 11 seconds. He had never lost 22 ships in an entire campaign.
"Return fire," he ordered.
"All ships, full barrage, target every human vessel." 569 functional Drakkari warships opened fire. The light show it produced was extraordinary. Energy beams and projectile fire and guided munitions filled the space between the 2 fleets in quantities that should have made it impossible for any target to survive. The human fleet was considerably smaller than the Drakkari's. The mathematics of it seemed absolute. The human fleet moved. It moved the way a murmuration of birds moved, not as a collection of individual ships, each making their own tactical choices, but as a single coherent entity, flowing and shifting and redirecting in patterns that absorbed the incoming fire and redirected it without losing formation cohesion. Ships that should have been caught in converging lines of fire slipped into gaps that opened and closed in the formation with machine precision. The coordinated positioning sent Drakkari fire into empty space, or, in several cases, into other Drakkari ships whose own maneuvering had placed them on the wrong side of the exchange. And the human ships kept firing, not wildly, not in the saturation patterns that the Drakkari used, filling space with fire and accepting that not all of it would hit. The human weapons fire was deliberate and surgical. Target selection happened in fractions of seconds. Ships that had already lost shields were prioritized. Other groups that had been separated from the main formation by maneuvering were isolated and neutralized before they could rejoin. The pattern of engagement shifted constantly, finding vulnerabilities faster than the Drakkari tactical officers could identify and address them. 34 ships neutralized, then 41, then 58. The numbers kept moving, and they kept moving in the wrong direction. Commander Styx slammed her fist on her console and turned to Voran. "They are not fighting a battle," she said. Her voice had changed. The certainty was gone from it. "They are hunting. They are hunting us systematically, cutting off weak ships, isolating them." "I know what they are doing," Voran said quietly. "Then give me a counter-strategy." He had no counter-strategy. The humans had trained against exactly this fleet, against Drakkari technology, Drakkari tactics, Drakkari weapons. They had spent 300 years inside a quarantine zone with nothing to do but prepare. They had prepared for this. "Soren?" Voran said. "What do they want?" The analyst looked up. He understood the question. "They want us to leave," he said simply. "That is all they have ever wanted. Look at their targeting choices, Supreme Commander. They are neutralizing rather than destroying. They could be killing our crews. They are choosing not to. They want us to run." He paused. "I recommend we consider it." Styx started to object. Voren raised one hand. "Open a channel to the human flagship," he said. The surface battle was a different kind of education entirely. Mikhail had been a xenobotanist before the invasion changed everything. He had spent his career in the forests of Veth Solara's northern continent, cataloging species that no one else had gotten around to cataloging yet, living a quiet life of research and field notes, and the particular satisfaction of finding something that had been unknown and making it known. He had joined a human ground unit 2 hours after they landed because he wanted to document what was happening. A young human sergeant had looked at him for a long moment, taking in his 4 arms and compound eyes, an obvious lack of any combat experience whatsoever, and said, "You can come if you stay behind us, stay low, and do exactly what I say when I say it. You good with that?" KL had been good with that. The sergeant's name was Reyes. She was small. All humans were small compared to the Drakkari, but Reyes was small even compared to the other humans in her squad. Her hair was a reddish color that KL had never seen on a biological organism before, cut short on the sides and longer on top. She moved through the ruined streets of the city with the unhurried, absolutely deliberate movement of something that had evolved to live in exactly this kind of environment. Her squad moved the same way. KL had expected soldiers to move like the Drakkari moved, loudly, with force, making their presence known as a deterrent. The Drakkari ground forces swept through occupied territory like the weather. Their footsteps could be heard from a kilometer away. They did not hide. Why would they hide? They were the threat. They wanted to be seen. The humans did not want to be seen until they chose to be. They moved through shadows and side corridors and gaps and collapsed buildings with a quietness that Kale's recording equipment had trouble capturing, because his equipment had been calibrated for normal noise levels and human movement at combat speed, was simply not producing the ambient sound his software expected from a group of 11 beings. Contact. Corporal Vash's voice came over the squad communicator. He was a young man with very precise eyes, positioned on a higher floor of a damaged building overlooking the plaza below. 4 Drakkari. Moving southeast, 20 meters, Reyes raised her hand. The squad stopped. Not a slow, cautious stop. A complete, immediate, total stop, 11 beings simultaneously becoming stationary as if someone had flicked a switch. They waited. The Drakkari patrol came around the corner into the narrow street. 4 of them, in full armor, weapons drawn, moving with the heavy confidence of occupying forces in enemy territory. They were 3 times the size of the human soldiers. Their natural armor plating was supplemented with military-grade composite. Their weapons were Drakkari standard issue, capable of burning through the kind of cover that the humans were currently using. They saw the humans at the same moment the humans moved. What happened next was extremely fast. Kale's recording equipment captured it in playback review later, and he watched it several times, trying to understand the sequence of events. The humans fired together, coordinated without verbal commands, targeting their shots in a pattern that addressed the most dangerous elements of the patrol first, and the least dangerous last. 2 Drakkari were incapacitated immediately. The third, larger than the other 3 and faster, covered the distance to the nearest human soldier with a speed that should have been the end of the encounter. That soldier was Reyes. She did not run. She did not try to put distance between herself and the Drakkari. She moved toward it, inside the range of its longer limbs, and used the confined space of the narrow street in a way that made the size differential irrelevant. The Drakkari could not swing freely. Reyes could. The exchange lasted 4 seconds. The Drakkari was on the ground. The 4th had already turned to run. "Vash," Reyes said, breathing slightly harder than normal but speaking in a normal tone of voice. "He's yours." From the elevated position, 1 shot. Clean, precise. The fleeing Drakkari went down. "Clear," Vash said. "That was fast," another soldier said. "Almost too easy." "Don't say things like that," Reyes replied. The universe has ears. Kale stared at the scene. He stared at Reyes. She was checking the status of her squad with quick glances, confirming everyone was functional. One soldier had a burn mark on her armor from a glancing hit. She was rolling her shoulder to check the range of motion, decided it was acceptable, and resumed her position. "How are you doing this?" Cale asked. He had not meant to say it out loud. The question escaped before he could stop it. Reyes looked at him. Her eyes were an unusual color, not compound like Aelhari eyes, but with a peculiar depth to them. "Practice," she said. Then, after a pause and about 300 years of nothing to do but get better at it, the squad moved deeper into the occupied city. Over the next several hours, Cale documented things that he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe accurately in his field notes. He saw a human soldier take a serious hit to the upper body. The wound was significant. The soldier pressed a field seal device against it, said a word that the translation software flagged as vernacular, likely profanity, and continued the engagement. Later, when Cale asked the medic attached to the squad whether that was normal, the medic said, "For a hit like that? Yeah, pretty much." The suit absorbed most of it. He'll be sore tomorrow. He saw a human soldier whose weapon malfunctioned at the worst possible moment. She had about 1 second to make a decision. She made it. Drew a secondary weapon, a blade that she had apparently been carrying for exactly this kind of situation, and continued advancing rather than retreating. "She's not supposed to be enjoying this," one of the other soldiers muttered as they watched. "Sergeant Pak always enjoys the blade work," another replied. "Leave her alone." But the thing Cale watched that changed something in him permanently happened late in the second day, when a group of Drakkari ground forces, realizing their position was no longer viable, broke from cover and ran. They were fast. Drakkari were built for sudden, explosive movement, short sprints at very high speed, enough to close distances and disengage from unfavorable positions. They ran east into the open ground between the city ruins and the forest, and within 30 seconds they had opened a gap of nearly 100 meters between themselves and the nearest humans. Cale had expected the humans to let them go, or to use long-range weapons to stop them. Instead, Reyes spoke 2 words into her communicator: persistence protocol. The humans started running. Not fast, not the explosive sprint that the Drakkari used. A steady, measured pace that ate ground without burning reserves. The Drakkari looked back, saw the humans falling behind, and accelerated. The gap widened to 200 meters. The Drakkari slowed slightly, conserving energy, maintaining distance. The humans maintained their pace. The Drakkari sped up again. The gap grew. 300 meters, 400. The humans maintained their pace. Cale watched from the back of the group. He was keeping up, barely, because the human pace was not a sprint and his 4 legs could manage it. But he watched the Drakkari ahead, and he watched the humans around him, and he began to understand something that he had not understood before. The Drakkari were burning at unsustainable rates. Short burst, high-speed movement required enormous energy expenditure. They could outsprint these humans indefinitely for 30 seconds at a time. But the humans were not doing 30 seconds. The humans were doing hours. An hour into the pursuit, the Drakkari were 2 kilometers ahead. They had slowed substantially. Their explosive pace had moderated to something closer to the humans' pace, but they were working harder to maintain it. An hour and a half, they had slowed more. The gap was 1 kilometer. The humans were still running at exactly the same pace they had started with. 2 hours. The gap was 500 meters. The Drakkari were breathing in the labored way that large, heavily armored, sprint-adapted creatures breathed when asked to sustain activity they were not designed for. Several of them were staggering. The humans were still running. Kyle had not paid much attention to the emotional state of the soldiers around him. He had been too focused on observing and documenting. But now, with the end of this particular chase becoming visible, he noticed something about the humans that surprised him. They were not grim. They were not hard-faced. They were not demonstrating the controlled aggression that he had seen in their expressions during the close quarters fighting in the city. They looked like people doing something they were good at, not with cruelty, not with malice, with a kind of professional satisfaction. When the last fleeing Drakkari sat down in the grass and stopped moving, Unable to continue, the squad surrounded them at a walking pace. Reyes crouched in front of the nearest one, who was breathing in great rasping heaves, and looked at him with her strange forward-facing eyes. "You have two choices," she said, and she was not even breathing hard. "You can surrender, or we can keep going." The Drakkari looked at the humans, at their steady breathing, at their calm faces. "We surrender," the Drakkari said. Reyes nodded. "Good call," she said. "That was only 6 kilometers. We were going to be at this for a while." On the third day, the orbital battle reached its conclusion. The Drakkari fleet had lost 147 ships, neutralized 33 destroyed in engagements where the exchange had gone wrong, and an indeterminate number of vessels that had simply moved to the extreme edge of the system and stopped participating. The human fleet had lost 11 ships destroyed and 22 with significant damage. The math of attrition was running in one direction, and everyone on every bridge in the system could see which direction it was. Supreme Commander Grath Voran sat in his command chair on the Unbroken Dominion and listened to the status reports come in. Each report was the same report with different numbers. The numbers were all moving the wrong way. A boarding team had taken his engineering deck 20 minutes ago. He had not expected that. He had expected the human fleet to maintain orbital engagement, trading fire at distance where their speed and coordination gave them advantage. He had not expected them to close to boarding range. Boarding was a tactic for when you were losing and needed to change the terms of engagement. The humans were not losing. "Why are they boarding?" Styx asked. She had asked it to herself, not to him, but the bridge heard it. Soren answered anyway. He had been doing that increasingly over the past 3 days, answering questions before they were asked, finishing sentences that people had not started yet. "Because they do not want to destroy the flagship," Soren said. "They want to take it. They want what is inside it. Records, intelligence, information about Drakkari operations and systems and targets." He looked at the commander. "They are thorough." The boarding team reached the bridge 12 minutes later. They came through the emergency access hatch in the ceiling, a hatch that Voran had not known anyone outside his own crew knew existed. He heard the cutting tool work through the seal. He heard the hatch open. He drew his personal weapon and stood. The humans dropped through in sequence, 4 of them, already moving to positions before they landed. They were fast, very fast for their size, which was small. Their weapons were raised. "Stand down," one of them said, not loudly. "Not aggressively. The way you said stand down when you were reasonably confident that you were going to be obeyed." Voran did not put down his weapon. The human who had spoken walked toward him. She was older than most of the others, with gray at her temples and a face that had accumulated the kind of expressions that took a long time to earn. She did not raise her weapon. She walked toward a Drakkari Supreme Commander holding a weapon pointed at her, and she walked like someone who was going to have a conversation. She stopped just outside of arm's reach. She looked at him. "You can fight," she said. "We will win. Or you can put that down and I take you to the Admiral." A pause. "She wants to talk to you. Not interrogate, not execute, talk. That is not normal behavior for a species you have been fighting for 3 days, and I understand if you are skeptical. But she said to tell you." She stopped. A brief look of something that might have been amusement crossed her face. "She said to tell you that your analyst was right about everything. She did not explain what that meant. I assume you will know." Voran looked at her. He looked at the weapon in his own hand. He set it down. The meeting between Grath Voran and Admiral Marisolano took place on the bridge of the Persistent Will, 12 hours after the fighting ended. Voran had been given a clean place to sit. He had been given water. No one in the room was holding a weapon. He found these facts more disorienting than the past 3 days of combat. Solano sat across from him. Her crew had left them mostly alone, with only 2 officers remaining at the far end of the bridge, working quietly at their stations. "Supreme Commander," she said. Her voice was the same voice from the transmission he had heard 3 days ago, the same calm, the same precision. Up close, he could see that she was older than she had appeared on the screen. There were lines around her eyes that spoke of long years and difficult decisions. "Let me be direct about your situation. Your fleet is broken. Your ground forces have been captured or disabled. You personally are in our custody. She folded her hands. You expected to be dead by now. He said nothing. I know you did, she said, because that is what your people would do. Captured enemy commanders do not typically get rooms with water and a conversation. She looked at him steadily. We are not going to execute you, Commander. I need you to hear that and believe it, because what I say next matters, and it will only matter if you believe I mean it. She stood. She walked to the viewport. Beyond it, the curve of Veth Solara filled the view, but differently from when he had last seen it from orbit. The fires that had lit the surface were going out. The smoke that had colored the atmosphere was beginning to clear. I have been in the military for 31 years, she said. I have seen what happens to species that are conquered. I have read the histories of the civilizations the Drakkari have taken. I know the current status of the people you have enslaved. She turned back to look at him. I do not say any of this to condemn you. I say it because I need you to understand what we are trying to change. Voren looked at her. You cannot change us, he said. The Drakkari are what we are. Evarian says that about themselves, she replied. Right up until they change. She came back to the table and sat. Here is the offer, Commander. I am going to release you. I am going to give you back your remaining functional ships, the ones that can be repaired and are not needed as evidence of this engagement. I am going to let you take your fleet back to Drakkari space. She paused. In exchange, you take a message to whoever makes decisions where you come from. What message? 2 parts. First, the Aelhari are under Terran protection. Every member species of the Galactic Assembly who has requested our protection is under Terran protection. If any Drakkari force threatens any of them, ever, we will respond, and we will respond with significantly more than 200 ships. She met his eyes. Second, we are not your enemy. We do not want to destroy the Drakkari. We do not want to occupy your territory or take your worlds. We want the conquering to stop. Not because we are afraid of you, because it is wrong, and we are strong enough to say so. A pause. The choice is yours. Change, or continue as you are, and eventually we find out how patient we both are. My people are very patient, Commander. 300 years of quarantine taught us that. Voren was quiet for a long time. He thought about what Soren had told him. He thought about the orbital battle that had gone wrong in every way that battles could go wrong when you were fighting something that had trained specifically to fight you. He thought about the ground forces. He thought about persistence protocol and what it felt like, apparently, to be chased by something that never stopped. Why mercy? He asked at last. You have the strength to end us. You said so. Your own officers recommended it. Why did you choose this instead? Solano looked at him for a moment before answering. My species spent a long time being the most frightening thing in any room, she said. Every species we met either ran from us or tried to lock us away. They saw what we could do, and they decided we were too dangerous to be near. She paused. The Aelhari were the first species in 300 years to ask us for help instead of fearing us. That means something. It means there is a different way to be known in this galaxy. She looked at the window. We want to be known differently, and the only way to do that is to make choices that are different. She extended her hand across the table. Voren looked at it. The human gesture, empty hand extended, no weapon. He was not entirely sure he trusted it, but he reached out and took it. What do you think happens next for these 2 species? Write it in the comments, because I think this is where the real story begins. The day the human fleet departed Veth Solara was the same day the first new structure went up in the ruins of Valanthas. It was not a dramatic building. It was a temporary shelter constructed from prefabricated components that the human ships had brought in their cargo holds, components that the Aelhari construction teams were already adapting to work with their own local materials, because the humans had brought human standard materials, and the Aelhari quickly demonstrated that they could modify anything with remarkable speed. Within 6 hours of the template going up, 3 Aelhari engineers and 1 confused human marine corporal were having a technical conversation that required significant amounts of gesturing and eventually resulted in a design that neither species had originally envisioned. Her High Chancellor Sci-Fi watched this from the steps of what had been the High Spire and was now a partially standing structure with a lot of open sky where the upper floors had been. Admiral Solano came to stand beside her. Sci-Fi had thought a lot over the past 3 days about what this moment would feel like. She had run through versions of it in her mind. She had imagined gratitude and relief and the complicated weight of owing a debt to someone you did not fully understand. She had expected to feel small, somehow, in the presence of whatever the humans turned out to be. She felt none of those things. She felt, and she would spend a long time later trying to find the right words for it. She felt recognized, as if something had looked at the Aelhari and seen not what they lacked, not the weapons they did not have and the soldiers they had never trained and the wars they had never fought, but what they were, 10,000 years of civilization. Were forests that glowed at night, cities that caught the light of twin suns, a species that had built everything they had on the idea that the universe was worth loving, and something had decided that was worth showing up for. Admiral, Sci-Fi said, I have to ask you something I should have asked before I pressed that beacon. Solano looked at her. Ask. The stories about your species, the ones the Galactic Assembly tells. The quarantine, the danger, all of it. How much of it is true? Solano was quiet for a moment. She was watching the construction across the plaza, the Aelhari and the human corporal arguing productively over a support beam configuration. All of it, probably, she said finally. We are what the stories say we are. We were built by a world that never let us rest, and the things that world made us into. We are still those things, she paused. But I hope, we are also other things, things that take longer to notice. Things that require a difficult situation and a choice made under pressure to be visible. She turned to look at Sci-Fi. Your people have 10,000 years of peace. That is extraordinary. That is harder than anything my species has ever done. We know how to fight. We have always known how to fight. Learning not to, choosing not to, even when it is the easy option, that is the hard thing. That is what the Assembly never believed we could do. Sci-Fi thought about this. About 10,000 years of peace. About whether the Aelhari had ever truly chosen peace, or simply never been given the opportunity to choose anything else. Perhaps, she said slowly, the galaxy has been looking at both our species wrong. For a very long time. She looked at the construction, at the corporal gesturing at a beam and an Aelhari engineer emphatically gesturing back. You are more than what you can destroy, and perhaps we are stronger than what we have never had to defend, Solano nodded. Something in her expression was different from how it had been in the 3 days of combat and crisis and emergency decisions. It was quieter, more itself. Chancellor, she said, when this reconstruction is further along, when your people are stable and the immediate emergency is past, I would like to propose something. Propose? An exchange program, not military, scientists, engineers, scholars, your people and mine spending time in each other's territories, learning what the other knows, she paused. The Assembly quarantined us to keep us separate from the galaxy. Maybe it is time to reconsider that. Not by tearing up the agreement unilaterally, by demonstrating, one relationship at a time, that separation is not the only way to be safe. Sci-Fi looked at the small human woman standing beside her. She thought about the device that was still sitting on the council table in the bunker below what had been the High Spire, the beacon, the device that had brought these beings here, the device that had started all of this. She thought about Dovan, who had said, "Do you know what you are asking for?" She thought about her answer, which had been yes. She thought about whether she had truly known. She reached out with one of her 4 arms, the human gesture, extended hand, no weapon, a reaching toward rather than a pulling away from. Solano took it. The construction continued behind them. The sky above Veth Solara was clearing. The twin suns caught the edges of the smoke that still lingered and turned it colors, violet and gold and the pale blue of early morning. And underneath those colors, under the evidence of everything that had been burned and broken, The first lights of the Aelhari's forests were beginning to appear in the ruins, soft blue-green. The color that 10,000 years of peace looked like in the dark. In the months that followed, the changes came gradually and then all at once. The Galactic Assembly convened an emergency session about the human response to the Aelhari emergency beacon. The session lasted 6 days. It was, by all accounts, extremely loud. The species that had maintained the human quarantine for 3 centuries now faced the fact that the quarantine had not prevented the humans from responding to a crisis. It had only prevented them from responding faster. And the response, when it came, had saved 900 million lives in approximately 42 hours of engagement. The arguments against the quarantine were gaining weight faster than the arguments for it could be restated. 3 Assembly member species immediately requested similar protection agreements with the Terran response fleet. 11 more opened diplomatic channels to discuss terms. The Aelhari, who had survived because they had pressed a beacon, became one of the most vocal advocates for a new kind of relationship between humanity and the wider galaxy. Or Elder Dovin, who had argued against pressing the beacon and had been wrong in the way that cautious people were sometimes wrong, not in their assessment of the risk, but in their assessment of the alternative, spent long hours in conversation with the young human engineers who stayed on to assist with rebuilding. He learned the names of their tools, and they learned the names of Aelhari plants, and by the end of the 3rd month he had authored a paper co-written with a human xenobiologist that would be cited in assembly proceedings for decades. He never stopped being cautious, but he changed what he was cautious about. The Drakkari were a different kind of story. Supreme Commander Grathvorin returned to Drakkari space with his damaged fleet and his message. He delivered it to the Drakkari High Command in terms that left very little room for interpretation. He described the engagement in detail, not to minimize it, not to frame the defeat as something other than what it was, but to transmit the reality of what had happened to people who needed to understand it. The High Command did not respond well initially. That was expected. A species with 10,000 years of conquest in their history did not pivot quickly. But some things could not be argued with. The casualty numbers could not be argued with. The recordings from the battle could not be argued with. And one thing, above all others, could not be argued with. The humans had won, comprehensively. And then they had let the survivors go. This was the part that the Drakkari strategists spent the most time on. Not the winning. Winning could be explained, analyzed, countered, theorized against. The letting go was harder. The Drakkari did not have a framework for it. Mercy, as a deliberate strategic choice, made from strength rather than weakness, was not a concept their doctrine had ever needed to include. They were including it now. The process was slow and imperfect and frequently threatened to collapse back into old patterns. But it moved. It moved because the alternative, which was another engagement with a human fleet that had had time to expand and improve, was not an alternative that any Drakkari strategist was willing to recommend. Analyst Soren, who had been right about everything, was promoted 3 times in 2 years. He found this uncomfortable in the way that people who have been consistently correct found recognition uncomfortable. He spent his career writing strategic assessments that started, always, from the same premise: the first question you must ask is not what am I strong enough to defeat, but what am I willing to be. Admiral Mara Solano spent 4 years on active duty after the battle, overseeing the expansion of the Terran response capability and the diplomatic negotiations that gradually, carefully, began dismantling the terms of the quarantine. She did not see it completed during her active service. She retired to a coastal posting where the sky on clear nights was full of stars she had been to and stars she had not. And she spent the last years of her career writing the kind of reports that were less about tactics and more about intention. She died on a Tuesday morning, surrounded by people who had followed her into places where the numbers did not make sense and trusted her anyway. Her successor gave a brief address at her memorial. The officer was young, much younger than Solano had been at the height of her career, from a generation that had grown up in a galaxy that was subtly but unmistakably different from the one Solano had entered as a recruit. A galaxy where the Aelhari's forests had regrown and the twin suns caught their blue-green bioluminescence at dusk, and visitors from 11 species came to walk in them. The address was short. It ended with something Solano had written in her last formal report. She wrote we spent 300 years being contained because we were too dangerous to be free. Then we spent one day being exactly what we were, and it saved 900 million lives. The lesson is not that we should be proud of being dangerous. The lesson is that what you are is not the whole story. What you choose to do with what you are, that is the whole story. On Veth Solara, in the rebuilt capital of Valanthas, there was a memorial in the central plaza, not a monument to combat. A garden tended by both Aelhari and human hands, planted with species from two separate worlds that had no business growing beside each other and did so anyway. At the center of the garden there was a stone. On the stone were 3 lines. The first they called for help from the darkness. The second something answered. The third neither was what the other expected. Both were what the other needed. High Chancellor Sci-Fi visited the stone on the last morning of her life, when she was very old and her shell had gone silver and her wings had not carried her in years. She sat beside it in the early light, with the twin suns coming up over the rebuilt skyline and the forest sounds beginning their morning conversation, and somewhere in the distance the sound of a construction project, always a construction project, on Veth Solara, always something being made new. She thought about the beacon, about the moment she had pressed it, about not knowing what would come, about coming anyway. She thought about the humans, about what they were, about monsters that chose to be something else, about predators who showed up for a species they had never met because someone asked them to. She thought that the galaxy had been so busy being afraid of what the humans could destroy that it had never stopped to wonder what they might build if given the chance, and it had taken a burning sky and a desperate choice and a device with worn symbols on its surface to find out. She looked up at the twin suns. She was glad she had pressed it. She was glad something had answered. She closed her eyes and listened to the forest, and the city, and the distant construction, and the sounds of 10,000 years of peace continuing on the other side of a moment that had almost been the end of it. The morning went on. The lights came on in the forest. And the galaxy slowly, like all large things turning, began to face a different direction.